Welcome, everybody. I'm Linda Mall, founder of Accountability by Design, and more recently, founder of Readers of the Pack, because I am a passionate leader. That's been much of my leadership growth over the years is reading, reading, reading. And I am just so enjoying my interviews with these authors. It is a gift at this stage of my life, for sure. And I suspect it will be a gift for each of you today. So, a warm welcome to each of you who have joined us online. My co host is Laura Haynes, and she will be jumping in whenever it's convenient. She's also looking after all the technology on the other side. So, if you have an issue, ask Laura, not Linda. Yeah.
Thanks, Linda.
Save your questions for later. I will have questions for Shannon for 30 minutes, and then we'll open it up to all of you to ask your questions for the last 15 minutes of the call. So save them as we go along. And we'll also be sharing this video and the PowerPoint with you after the session, probably early next week. And so we'll share that with Shannon as well. You're all welcome to use it however you feel it would serve you. So this is not about marketing. This is not about growing the business. This is about sharing our love of reading with each of you and whoever else wants to listen to the recording. So please welcome Shannon Huffman Polson, author of The Grit Factor, which I absolutely loved. I think it's a great book for every leader. And it was absolutely riveting at times with those rich stories and full of proven strategies for developing grit. I also realized that I have a lot of grit in my own DNA that I have honed over the years. And so that was great learning as well. Welcome, Shannon. Glad to have you here today.
Thanks so much, Linda. It's such a pleasure to be with all of you.
Yeah, lovely. And I do have questions written down, so I'm going to go to buy a script because otherwise we'll be here until 3 o'clock. Um, so what made you choose this as a career, Shannon? Why this?
Why the writing or why
Why the
whole ecosystem?
military and
Oh, the
yeah.
military. Okay, we'll go back. Great. Yeah, it's a little bit of a tangled, windy road, and it always has been for me, but I think that makes it a little bit more interesting. I grew up in Anchorage, Alaska, went from there to Duke University in 1989, just to date myself properly and pinpoint that date exactly. And at Duke, I was the eldest of three children, and the finances were certainly a stretch for our family. And so I decided I was working three jobs at college anyway, and I decided to try ROTC and see if that were something that resonated. And I didn't expect that it would at all, although my dad had been a JAG officer. But it ended up being something that I really, really enjoyed and found a ton of value in. And so the short story, there's a longer story that you've read in The Grit Factor, if you've read The Grit Factor, but is that I left Duke and went on to active duty then and was on active duty for about 8 years after 2 years in the Guard as a part of my college. And so that was something that I just found as a real sense of purpose, a sense of meaning, a sense of serving something bigger than myself, which was very much part of our family's DNA growing up. And I think the combination of those factors made it a really good fit at that time.
Mhm. Yeah, interesting choice for a woman at that point in time, right?
Yeah, and
Not
what's
an easy
interesting,
road.
our ROTC class actually had we had a really awesome group of fellow cadets, they call them, at
Mhm.
that point, and there were a number of women in that group,
Oh,
which was great, and they were tough, and they were some of the best actually in the cadet battalion. Pardon?
yeah.
Yeah, and so I think that was, and I had grown up doing lots of sports and lots of mountaineering and lots of like skydiving, and so I have always done stuff with lots of guys, and that's been my
Nice.
whole life.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so it was a very
Me too.
natural. connection.
Yeah, me
That
too.
didn't bother me. Going into aviation and then attack aviation was a completely different thing. That was all guys and a very and sometimes a less inviting
Mhm.
environment. Although I also worked with some of the best people that I'll ever know in my life, so I like to make that
Nice.
caveat. It's just a very insular environment, and so there's the best and the
Mhm.
worst, and you're in it for sure. So
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. In the book, you said the Apache reminded you of a praying mantis. So I had a visual more than a helicopter. To put that conversation into perspective, tell us about the Apache and what it felt to fly the world's most sophisticated helicopter machine.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a pretty amazing machine. I mean, it's a very large helicopter, not the biggest at all, but there's two engines. Both of them are 1,850 horsepower. It's 58 feet long. It's 12 feet high. It's 18 feet across. I mean, it's a very large aircraft, and it is essentially a weapons platform. So there are just two pilots, and both of the aviators that are in the aircraft are rated aviators. One of them in the front seat focuses is the co-pilot gunner, and that person's job in a mission profile is to navigate, to communicate, and to shoot. And then the person in the back seat is the one that keeps it out of the trees, is what we used to say. So we fly very, very low, very slow in a helicopter, totally different than jets and airplanes. And so so very different types of threats, very different types of employment than an Air
Mhm.
Force pilot or a Navy pilot would have had. But it was an incredible, I mean, just an amazing aircraft to fly, incredible amounts of power. You realize when you leave the military that you've played with the best toys you're ever going to play with in your life. And that's just nothing is going to come close to that again. But it was interesting too, though, from the aviation perspective, because when you start to fly, when you learn to fly, we learned when I was going through in Hueys. Now I think they learn in a smaller airframe. And then I went to 58s, which is like a Jet Ranger. It's smaller than the Huey, a lot more kind of finicky. And so there's a lot to play with in terms of trying to keep the helicopter steady. But once you move into the larger airframes, because they're doing so many other things as well, it becomes more systems management. And the aircraft is stabilized often so that you're not playing with the aircraft so much, but you're actually managing all of the systems within the aircraft to perform the mission. So it was a incredibly um, demanding and really a lot of fun to have the opportunity to work in aviation. So
I can hear the excitement. It still sits. I can
it's been a
still
while,
feel
but
it. Yeah.
yeah, no, it was great.
Yeah. So your book is full of stories, like just one after the other. Is there one pivotal learning moment that you had along that journey that you could share with this audience today? I mean, you can't share all, but
Yeah, well, for those who haven't read it, one of the things that I wanted to do was not just have my own experience, because I am one person who reacts in a certain way to certain things based on my background and the situations that I was presented in. And I recognize that, and I have recognized that, and all of us do as we get older in our lives, as one of many experiences. And so it was really an opportunity for me, just to back up a little bit, to interview other leaders in the vanguards of their fields who happen to be women, and they happen to be military, and they included general officers from across the services, aviators from World War II to the present, a combat rescue swimmer in the Coast Guard, a submariner, and many, many more. And I wanted to do that because I wanted to bring all of those experiences to bear on how to think about, and how I would even think about, grit and resilience and leadership based on not just my own experiences, but also bringing together all of these other experiences as well as the secondary research. And that was really important to me because, as the older we get, the more we realize we're just one voice of many. And so that's what the grit factor is bringing all of those pieces together, telling
Mhm.
those stories that other leaders shared so incredibly generously with me, as well as making that connect in with my own experience as well. So, um, I mean, I think one of the stories that I tell relatively early in the grit factor, and I do think it was one of the places where there was a real recognition of my own need to be able to not do what was expected in order to be able to contribute my best self. And I think leadership is about helping others contribute their best selves to the world, right? And all of us should want to contribute our best selves to the world. It's not about us, it's about what we give. And so when I was still a cadet at Duke in ROTC. I was a senior in college, so I'm not yet graduated. I'm not yet commissioned. I'm just a college student, and I had been drilling with the National Guard as part of my scholarship for the final 2 years of college, which was a requirement because my scholarship was through the National Guard. And I drove out to the state aviation office in Raleigh, North Carolina, from our campus in Durham to receive my assignment for the years ahead. And I remember reporting to this colonel, and this colonel, at the time when you're not even a lieutenant yet, the colonel seems so old and so wise and so powerful and so important. And I remember standing in front of his desk, and he had this desk that seemed like it was as wide as the room, and these shiny windows that went up behind him. And I was trying not to shake and standing at attention, and saluted, and he asked me to sit down. And then we started to exchange some conversation back and forth. And then I remember him stopping in the middle of a sentence and leaning back in his chair and looking down his nose and saying, "You realize, cadet, that you will never fly an attack aircraft." And I'd never been in a position in my life at that point where somebody had kind of so blatantly been rude and disrespectful and kind of just a jerk, I mean, the funny thing is, at the time, like, attack aircraft weren't even open to women to fly, so it was sort of an unnecessary comment. And I don't even know that had been on my radar in terms of what my expectations were, or even where the direction that I thought that I was going to go. And I realized in that moment that there were people that were going to either not support or actively hold me back, and others as well. And I also realized in that moment that there was nothing that I could do except for say, "Yes, sir." And so I said, "Yes, sir," and then moved out smartly, and then did what I could do within the context of the ROTC organization, which included some amazing cadre, and actually this awesome aviation major named Major Lindemann. I don't remember his first name, but I remember going into Major Lindemann back at the Duke University campus, and I said, "Sir, I want to go active duty. Like, I want to get I want to be out of the Guard. I want to go active duty." And he said, "Well, the paperwork is a little bit late, but we'll get this done." And realizing, when sort of that old adage, when one door closes, another opens, or sometimes you have to kick the door down. And so that was a really good realization, and I think kind of a wake-up call too, that people were not always going to be supportive, and they might actively resist forward progress, and that I was going to have to make my own way if I wanted to be able to do my best work.
Challenge accepted. That's how, when I read the story, I thought, challenge accepted. Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly.
Interesting. Lovely. Laura, do you want to ask a few questions?
Yeah, I have a few questions. In the book, you talk about, well, you state, in the process of becoming, you need to believe in yourself.
Yep.
And you first have to understand yourself. That has to precede integration with the larger whole. Can you speak more to that, around the importance of identity, really?
Yeah.
And it's so important, obviously, in all the stories that you're telling, and knowing who you are and where you want to go. And how did that come
Yeah,
to fruition?
I'm really grateful for that question, in part because when I wrote The Grit Factor, and as I speak about it today, I don't want to at all pretend that I knew that at the time. Some of this is looking back at those experiences and realizing, hey, maybe I didn't know where I wanted to go. Maybe I didn't really know who I was. And it's one of the reasons that the work that I do now, I speak to companies and organizations around the world on grit and resilience and leadership and purpose, right? And part of the training that I also deliver online in these 6-week training blocks to companies or to individuals really does focus in on understanding ourselves first. And the reason for that is because I think when you're a young person, and maybe there are other young people who were and are far ahead of where I was at the time, but it's easy to be looking for who you are outside of yourself. And the military will certainly deliver that to you, and in fact requires that of you, right? There's a breaking down of the individual and a building up into the team. And I think it's really important for each person to give themselves the time and the space to do the work to understand what their values are, what is important to them, where they think they want to go right now. That may not be where you want to go in a year or in 5 years or in 10 years, but it's where your direction is right now. And if you don't do that, and you don't have a sense of who you are and what your values are, the world will deliver that to you. And it won't always be something that is either in concert with or even consistent with the integrity of who you are. And oftentimes it will be in opposition to that. And that becomes then more of a struggle and more of a challenge. And so giving yourself the time and the space, and that's why you have chapters 1 and 2 of the Grit Factor, which is really focused on what I now think of as the base of the grit triad, right? It's knowing yourself. It's, the old oracle at Delphi, right? Is first know thyself, I think. And it's doing that work before you move forward into a leadership position where you're then helping others know themselves and also helping them then do their best work. So really, really important, and not something that we often give ourselves enough time to do.
Mhm.
Oh, that's so true. I'd like to help younger people in my life that I work around to give themselves the grace to know themselves. They just sometimes don't know what they don't know, right? So
They don't know what they don't know, but also like building the confidence to respect the fact that,
yeah,
hey, I might be
About
different
Sandy
in
Cook
this
you can
way.
have.
I'm differentiated in this way, and respecting the fact that that's okay. And not only is that
yes,
okay, that may ultimately be a superpower. You've just got to own that and then live into that. And I had a hard time doing that, especially I showed up at an Apache battalion, and I knew they were all guys. I knew I was like 23 years old. I was the first woman pilot to show up out of 120, male pilots. And I had my hair cut super short, kind of like I see John in the picture there, almost about as short as John's. Not a good look for me. But I was like, you know what? I'm going to give people nothing to say. I'm not going to give and I'm going to max my PT test, and and I did all of those things. But I think, and not that those were necessarily bad, but at the end of the day, it's easy to start to compromise yourself to fit into another sort of a space. And I think especially if you're a minority in an environment, in a majority environment, to try to fit into that majority. And it doesn't ultimately serve either you or your contributions to the greater good at all when you do that. And so that's some learning that I think has evolved over time and not something that I had in the moment, for sure.
yeah, no, that's very well said. You use the term the great cauldron of story. Can you explain the role of values as it relates to purpose and creating a story that becomes a place
Yeah.
to which you can repeatedly return to and just find the strength in hardship? And on that note, I will tell you that I'm reading your book, North of Hope.
Oh, thank you.
Uh, but anyway, I will leave you with that. I won't
Yeah.
get into it, but yes.
Yeah, thank you. That was my first book, is a much more personal memoir, not
Yeah.
military related, but certainly has grit is a big part of it. And although I didn't think of it that way when I wrote it, but yeah. So the concept of, or the term, the Great Cauldron of Story, is actually not mine. It's quoting Maria Tatar, who is a professor of Germanic language at Harvard, and she looks back at fairy tales over the centuries and over various cultures as well, and realizes that there are some of the same stories that are told on different continents at the same time. It's actually completely fascinating. I mean, ideas like Little Red Riding Hood and those sorts of things, and the types of lessons that we learn from those stories, and the power of those stories in instructing us and in directing us in the way that we live our lives and the way that we face challenges and all those sorts of things. And many of you may know, the original fairy tales are a lot more grim. Some of them are written by the Brothers Grimm, right? But they're much more grim than the fairy tales that we read our children today. So they really were a way of really helping people deal with, like, what is the worst possible thing that could happen, and how is the person going to get through, right? Ultimately, you do make it through those dark woods, and you do drop the breadcrumbs, and you can find your way out, but it's pretty brutal in the meantime. And those were the stories that we've told over millennia to be able to help to direct ourselves and the way that we face challenges. And so that's important from an external perspective, is like, what stories are we bringing into our awareness and into our psyches, and what stories are we reading? What stories are we, I hate the word consuming, but it is consuming, right? It's lots of different types of media, lots of different ways of bringing those types of stories into our awareness, because they become who we are. And those of us who are parents know you want to be careful with what your kids get into, because it all becomes part of who they are, and they don't get that at all. Right? They want to watch every single Marvel movie or whatever. I'm like, wait, we're going to watch the great debaters in there, because you've got to get the values in there too. And so I think being careful about what you bring into yourself, and in terms of how you think about your own story and how you think about the world, is important. but then doing the work to go back and own your own story in that broader context. And we don't, any of us live in a vacuum. We all live within a social construct and then within relational constructs and within cultural constructs. And so going back and looking at our stories can be an incredible source of lots of things, but it can be a source of strength if you learn how to think through past challenges, past failures, past obstacles, and think through, like, how did I meet that obstacle? What were the tools that I used to overcome this challenge? Where did I fail, and how could I do that differently the next time? Who came in and walked with me in this challenge or through this obstacle? And when you do that work, you start to pull together, and I think psychologists call this concept of coherence, right? Is you start to bring together coherence in your stories in a meaningful way that then helps you to continue to do your best work in the world. I'm going to keep coming back to, we all want to do our best work in the world. And so when we're bringing these stories together in the right way, because we can interpret stories in many different ways, our own and others, when we do that in a way that's productive, that can really be a source of incredible strength and power for future challenges. And I don't think there's enough that we can say about that, because we literally live within story, and all of the ancient wisdom traditions, whether they're religious or whether they're philosophical, they're all of them story-based. And they're story-based because that's how our brains take in information. It's how our brains make things coherent. It's how our brains process information. I mean, this is all the neuroscience behind story now, which is totally fascinating. I could nerd out on this for a while, but I guess all of this goes to support the importance of and the idea of, it's very, very important to go back and consider our own stories, make sure we're reframing them in a way that acknowledges the truth of them, but also sets us up for doing better the next time, or drawing strength from those previous challenges, so that we can do, as the women's basketball coach at Duke University says now, she's like, you do hard better, right? And she's awesome. Carol Lawson, if you don't know her, you should look her up. But you do hard better, and you do hard better by knowing how you've done it well in the past.
Amazing. Thank you for that, Shannon.
So I want to pick up on a little bit of what you talked about in the chapter around community, because you made a comment that also, I'm going to read it so I get it right. All soldiers know it is a circle of community that pulls them through the hardest times. And
Yes.
I know that to be true. My brother-in-law was in the military and the airborne, and I saw that. I personally witnessed it. But can you tell me more about that and how that supported you?
Yeah, I mean, the military is a pretty special community in so many ways. I mean, there's big things and there's little things. I just think back to, the couple that I dedicated the book to, were Tori and Dugald Macmillan, who both have passed away now. And I met them actually whenever I got to a new base, I looked for a church. So I'm a good Episcopalian, found an Episcopal church, I found a gym, and I found a choir. Those were my three requirements, because I've done classical choral singing my whole life. And so I went to St. John's Episcopal Church in Fayetteville, North Carolina, and there had just been this newspaper article about me because I was the first woman to fly the Apache there, which I think, was newsworthy then, I guess. I don't think the guys in my unit necessarily appreciated it, but and there was an older couple. He was an infantry colonel from Vietnam, and his wife Tori, and they were the most gracious Southern people that you could possibly imagine. And they kind of cornered me at the water cooler, literally at the church, and started to have me over for dinners, and became really family in Fayetteville, just out of nowhere. I mean, for no reason other than that. I think they understood that need for community. I'm a single young lieutenant that has no family anywhere on that side or corner of the country at all. I'm from Alaska originally. And they really became this incredible support system, and just in more ways than I can even share. And there's no way really to even possibly give them enough credit for how it was that they supported me as a young lieutenant. And I remember, and I think I tell this story in the book, but coming back from Bosnia, and all of the guys that I worked with, I think people get married younger in the military a lot of times, and all of the guys pretty much were married or had girlfriends or something. And so we're all coming back from Bosnia, and we didn't know when exactly we were coming back, because flights get canceled and then they rescheduled
Mhm.
and canceled and rescheduled, and you manifest and you wait and you manifest and you wait. And so we were landing in the middle of the night back at Fort Bragg, and now called Fort Liberty. And I was going to just be, arriving to my car, so at a friend's house that I would have to get a ride to. And I remember we landed, it was pitch black. There's all these families lined up. I don't have family at the time because I'm single still. And Dougal and Tori were there, and they're this they're in their late 70s, and they had been calling the operations center to make sure that they knew when the flight was landing, and it was 2 o'clock in the morning, and these two like elderly people from my church were there to meet me, and it was just very special. And they understood, they understood the concept of what that community meant. And um anyway, I miss them both very much, and they were lovely, lovely people. There are many, many other stories like that, but that was one that really stands out, and that's why the book is dedicated to them.
Heartwarming, heartwarming. So you also commented that if you're sitting, and I think every leader needs to pay attention to this, if you're sitting around the table with people who all look like you and
Yes.
sound like you, you're going to have a narrow view of things. I believe that holds true in the corporate world. How do
Completely.
you decide who's on your dream team that you talked about
Yeah.
and who is not?
Man, this is such an important question now, not just because of the efforts to have more diverse boards and more diverse C-suites, but because our communities and our country is so polarized in so many ways, right? And I really believe it's so important for us to just sit down and talk to people that we don't agree with, and
Mhm.
ideally get their feedback on what it is that you're doing. I mean, that's a different thing than politics, of course, but you want different ways of thinking to come to the table in order to come up with the best solution. And I think the best leaders know this. I think it's weak leaders who don't, and it's
Mhm.
egotistical leaders who want people who are all around them that look just like them. But the reality is, from the diversity perspective, that is one of the challenges with diversity. And one of the women that I interviewed for the book, who's become a very good friend of mine now, is a senior manager at Amazon, said, essentially she would go out and try to figure out why she wasn't on the flight manifest. And she literally had her commander say, look, I'm looking for guys that look like me and you don't look like me. I mean, literally said that. So it couldn't be put more plainly that is, in fact, and in some fairness, I mean, I prefer people to be a little upfront with their biases, so I know what I'm working with, and she certainly knew what she was working with. But that is our natural inclination. And so I think for all of us, whether we're men or women, whether we're black or white, whether whoever we are, know that that is our natural inclination, is to look for people that are like us, and force yourself to break through that and say, I need somebody that doesn't look like me, that doesn't come from that same background, that doesn't have the same perspectives as I do, because I really do want to come to the right solution. And the right solution isn't necessarily mine. And it's not necessarily the one that's going to come from the people that are just like me. It's from a more diverse group of perspectives. And if you're in the corporate world, you've got to have that to be able
Yeah,
to ensure that you're making the best decisions, but also that you can sell to a diverse group of customers. And you can't do that if you only have one kind of voice. And so there's
yeah,
just a million reasons why this is important. But I think the key takeaway is that we all naturally do this. It's a natural inclination. So you've got to fight that natural inclination in order to come up with the best results. And the best leaders will do that, and the worst won't.
and for many reasons. Some of it, I mean,
Yes,
it's easier when someone's on the same page as you and you're going along. It's easy to brainstorm to make things happen, right? It can
exactly.
be exciting. So it's harder to connect with someone who has a different style, a different perspective, a different viewpoint, all of those things. But it's so rich when we do it. It's just so rich. Yeah.
100%. Yes, that's completely true.
It just really, and I think we are more polarized than we've ever been since in my lifetime. We are
Yes,
more
yes.
polarized than we've ever been. So more important than it's ever been, for sure.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
loved your mantra, act, listen, pause. And I've been actually practicing that in my personal life.
Yeah.
And I love the M&M story because
Oh,
I love M&Ms. Can you share that story with the audience? And then I think we're going to have to open it up. We had more
yeah.
questions. but
I've got to
yeah.
remember this one because it's not mine, right? It was another
Okay.
officer's, and it was one of the general officers, I think. Just want to make sure I get it right. And I think, please go read the book to make sure I don't get this wrong. She was actually asked to go in while she was working at the Pentagon, and I'm not even remembering whose story this is exactly. This is terrible. But she was asked to go in and brief, and I think it was Schwarzkopf. I'm pretty sure. I want to say Krulak, but I think it was Schwarzkopf. And he had M&Ms on his
It
desk.
was Schwarzkopf.
Yes, it was Schwarzkopf. Thank you. And so she was asked to go in and brief him on the state of affairs in a certain part of the military that her office was working on. And she was actually subordinate to the person who should have been briefing him. But she was asked for her opinion, and she actually I think dug into his M&Ms and set up an example of how to look at units and what was going on, and he ended up using some colorful language and telling her to keep her something hands off of his M&Ms. But at the end of the day, really appreciated her being very forthright with what the challenges are, and in a subsequent briefing asked that she would be sent to give the briefing as opposed to her boss. So I think that was a that was actually sort of spectacular. I wish I could have been a fly on the wall there. But I do think that one of the things that comes out of that story was not just her willingness to be pretty brave, right? And sticking up in an environment that felt hostile, but he was not hostile to her. He was just kind of that kind of guy, right? And she knew that. And she also, and she speaks to that actually specifically, right? She talks about in that story, you got to know who you're talking to and what it is they're trying to say and the ways that they're trying to say it. And in that way, he wasn't being in any way obstructive to her or to anything else. He was just that kind of guy, and she knew that. And so she worked with him in the way that he needed to be worked with, and he really appreciated it. And that ended up in her being called back to do that again. So that is that's a great story. I love that story. Thanks for bringing that up.
Even as I sit here now, there's somebody on this call who that story would resonate with, because she told a similar story in a coaching call that I had earlier this week. And so it is about really thinking about who that human is.
Yes.
And how are they showing up, and how do you connect with them?
Yes, that's right. And being willing and able, and this is not easy for any of us, depending on what it is that you're adapting, but you have to adapt your style, right? To be able to communicate effectively with somebody else, unless you are Schwarzkopf, and then other people can adapt their style to you. But most of us aren't that guy.
None of us on this call are that individual. So, Laura, do you want to lead off with a question for the open to the audience?
I'm going to turn it over to the audience. I'm going to ask the audience. We've got Shannon here, one-on-one experience. Does anyone have a question they'd like to ask Shannon?
Well, I'll start, Shannon. I'll give you an assist. I just looked it up. It's D. McWilliams.
Thank you. Yes. She's fabulous.
Good.
Oh my gosh, she's fabulous. Thank you so much, John. I appreciate that.
Which is interesting, because I think as I pulled open my Kindle here and was looking at those couple of pages, that what she was promised a command, checked into her unit, and then found out that the colonel, the commander there, had given it to someone else. And then she was, call it, stuck in a planning role, a staff role. So she already maybe had a little bit of a, I don't know, she had something, a little bit of a chip on her shoulder, but then she handled it extremely well, which that's to the point of the story that you told.
She's incredibly spunky. My gosh, these leaders were really a joy to connect with. I learned so much just from that process of working with them to put the book together. So yeah, thank you.
I have a question. So this was about 4 years ago you published this. I just discovered it, I don't know, a week ago, 2 weeks ago. I first heard of it and I just read it. It was a fantastic book. So it's been 4 years since you've written something else, or you're working on anything else. You've met a lot of interesting people since then. You spoke a couple minutes ago about stories. I'm sure you've picked up some more stories along the way. Are you working on something else?
Thanks for that. Yeah, so there are writers who don't know what to write, but want to be writers. And there are people like me who are the opposite. And I literally have 10 books in my head that I am ready to write. I think it's the ADHD brain or something. But yeah, so I have a proposal right now that I have been sitting on for like a year and a half because I wasn't quite sure about it. And I actually changed the direction. Now I'm on the third iteration, and I think that's where it's going to stick. So that proposal should go out within probably 2 weeks to an agent who will then start to shop it around, and it will be blowing out one of the areas of the grit factor kind of wide open and going both deep and wide. And so yes, so that is the next thing in the works. And then the writing is what I love, and so I will be writing for the rest of my life, God willing. And maybe not all in this genre, to be honest. Like, I think I have another book kind of in this genre, and then my first book is a memoir. It's creative nonfiction. I'll be doing, I hope, eventually more of that as well. But I also write essays and poetry, and so the essays are also obviously nonfiction. They're essays. One just came out in the Iowa Review on my military experience. I have had other military essays come out in other literary magazines, so more of a literary approach. And then I also write about the natural world. We live in a area of the country that is part of kind of the fire cycle that has come up in the last 10 years. And we actually had one burn right around our house 2 years ago. So writing about that as well. So those are the essays that I write separate from the business work that I do, which was not necessarily the question that you're asking, but I will continue to do work on those sorts of things as well. So
Fantastic. Thank you.
yeah, thank you. And John is writing a book as well. So he posted his work.
John, do you want to speak to what you're writing, just as an aside?
Sure. I will very briefly. I'm writing a book. I'm actually self-publishing. It is coming out in the next couple of weeks and within the month. The book, it's called Say Yes, Foundational Lessons from Combat Town, the Quigley, and Taking Invisible Paths. So I should share, I was in the military as well. I spent 10 years in the Marines. I was a helicopter pilot. Shannon and I actually went to the same graduate school. So that's kind of how we met 20 years ago, and we hadn't talked in 20 years, and here we are. How about that?
Awesome.
But the book is it's a collection of short stories, primarily from my time in the military, about those days and events that end up becoming these foundational lessons. If you can really just get that, understand that there was a foundational event. So I share some of those days. What was the lesson? And now, 20 years later, what am I doing differently because of that lesson? And there are really some, I think, universal lessons. So while there are my stories, the underlying themes, I think, apply to everyone.
Yeah.
So that's
Look
me.
forward to it.
John, that's the right way to do it. Well done. I can't wait for it.
Look forward to it. Yeah. Now, is there, as we took a little side trip, is there another question someone has for Shannon? Nobody?
Don't be shy.
So I'm going to ask about leadership. What is it? Muddy boots? Muddy leadership boots? Was that what I read? Yeah, muddy leadership boots.
Muddy boots leadership. Yeah.
Tell us more.
I mean, in a sense, it's the military. We called it muddy boots leadership. It equates pretty closely to what people in the corporate space will know as management by walking around, which is basically you've got to get out of your office and spend time with the people who are doing the work, and especially where the work is hard and especially where the work is dirty, be willing to get your boots dirty, essentially. And the idea behind that is that soldiers don't trust anybody whose boots are too shiny, because they're not out there doing the work, and they're not out there with the soldiers, and they're not out there with the people who are really doing what needs to be done. And so I'm a huge, huge, huge believer in that. It is hard to remind yourself to do that when you are doing all the stuff at your desk, right? And it seems like this is so important and I have so much to do and it's going to take me until 10 o'clock tonight. You still have to put it aside and you still have to go out and spend time with the people that are doing the work. And as a parent, that means putting stuff down and spending it with your kids. I mean, it's all the same sort of a thing. It's that personal interaction that really builds those relationships that allows you to support them in doing their best work. And you also then can hear the challenges that they're facing. You can get to know them as people. And that is, at the end of the day, I think one of the most important lessons that I ever learned was that the most important role you have as a leader is taking care of your people. And the only way that you can take care of your people is by knowing them and knowing what it is that they need and what their challenges are. And you won't know them or know those things until they learn to trust you and you have spent enough time with them where they're sharing that kind of information with you. And so that's what it's all about. There are other extensions of that as well, which is, there are really interesting studies on this management by walking around. Actually, that was done with hospital workers. that looked at people who did actually walk around, did actually talk to people on the front lines, but then did not follow up with them when they heard of challenges or heard of concerns. And so that actually has a more deleterious effect than if you never walked around in the first place. So you do need to walk around and spend time with people, but you also need to follow up on what their concerns are. And I think those were pretty important lessons that you learn. I mean, you learn that your soldiers are everything in the military. They're right. They are everything. And that's your whole reason to be there, is to support them doing their best work. And it's an honor to do that. And they're incredible human beings, but you've got to spend time with them to know how it is you can do your work, which is to support them in doing their work. So
I would suggest that applies to any leader. That's your role.
100%,
That is your role.
yes.
And
That's
the
exactly
better
right.
you are at that, the better your team is going to be, and the more productivity you have, all of it. Yeah,
That's
every
always
single time. Well, we are 3 minutes from our close.
Vera has a
And
question, if I
so,
can interrupt.
pardon? Oh, Vera, sure.
Sorry.
Yeah,
Sorry, I was trying to find the mute. I'm like, unmute, unmute. And then I didn't hit the buzzer fast enough. So yeah.
good. No, go ahead. Let's take.
Thank you. By the way, I haven't read your book yet, Shannon. Sold. I'm going to read it. It's eerie how you're speaking this language that is, you know, I think sometimes I think I'm crazy, and it's like verbatim. I think like we've worked together in the past life, you know, just even the story you just shared right now, the muddy boots, like that is so crazy. I'm going to pick it up. So with that said, I'll try to keep my questions short and sweet here. I have lots, but I'm just going to ask one.
Yeah.
I believe Laura earlier on asked the question with regards to the process of becoming and understanding yourself in the book. And I have, like I said, I haven't had a chance to read it, but my question to you is, do you believe that people are born with innate skills, and that's just who they are? And then what they do is they grow up and they say, you know, I want to be a firefighter, I want to be a dentist, I want to be whatever it is. And they go to school and they develop these skills, and they get their degrees, and they become a lot more educated out there. But somehow, some way along the line, they gravitate still towards what is innate, or do they? You know, how does somebody know whether or not they're kind of pushing themselves into a square peg and they're a round hole, or vice versa, right? Like somebody once told me, you gravitate towards what you are good at. Even if you want to be a finance manager and you're really great with numbers, but you've got this fantastic skill with people, you're going to end up there because that's where your passion is. But I'm more interested to hear your opinion on that.
I'm not sure that I'm educated enough in that area, which I think would be probably some pretty deep psychology stuff, and probably there's a lot of people that disagree and agree. I think that one of the what I would say is, I think if that is the case, there is also a potential oppositional danger that you will gravitate to where you are most rewarded, which may not be the same thing as where you can best contribute. And that is where that knowledge of yourself and your values and your goals really needs to be very strong, because at the end of the day, you know, you might get paid a lot of money to do this thing, or get a lot of prestige to do this sort of a thing. I mean, I literally have had 2 job opportunities brought up to me randomly from 2 different locations, which would both be extremely lucrative. And I'm now at a place in my life where I can say, you know what, that's not who I am right now. That's not where I want to go. This is not, I don't need that. I don't need the recognition. I don't want a lot of money for, I mean, that's just not what drives me. And so, but I think when you're young, sometimes that can be kind of this bright, shiny thing that can pull you away from what it is that you are meant to do. And so that's where that work is ongoing, to know ourselves, right? And I think it's natural, and it's good to have lots of experiences. So that's not necessarily even a bad thing. But continuing to do that work to say, is this really where I'm most meant to contribute? Is this really where I'm most meant to serve? Is super, super important and hard to remind ourselves to do, especially because once you go down one of those bright, shiny paths, it's going to be all consuming, right? And so there's less and less time to do that work, and you'll get more and more validation for doing this thing that, you know, might pay a lot, or might do something that looks shiny, but may or may not be your I don't want to say your passion. I don't think it's all about passion, but where again you're both most meant to show up. Where you are most meant to show up will also change over the course of your life, and it will change as your situations change, you get older, as you have more complex pieces of your life that are part of the overall environment that you're working in, you know, family and community and that kind of a thing. So I think there's a lot of nuance in that question. I really appreciate it, but I think it requires each person to really spend time and introspection on that. And I don't think, I guess I'm not a Calvinist. I don't think we're predestined to do anything. So I think you've got to kind of sort that out and figure that out as you go. And you do have some innate strengths, and you can develop other innate strengths, right? So I think all of those sorts of things all come into play. And I'm sorry that that's a bit of a, it depends sort of an answer, but
That's good.
yeah, anyway, I really love it though. So sign up for my Substack, and I'll try to answer that on a Substack
Okay,
later on.
you got it. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the thoughtful question.
Thanks.
And Farah, I am a believer that when you find your path, when you're really truly connected to your values and you're doing what fuels you, life is pretty delicious. And so I measure everything by a joy meter. When I'm finished doing it, I say how much joy was in that. And that informs my next decision. And so I'll share that with you. Yeah.
Thank you.
So as we close, I do want to say thank you, Shannon, for the precious time you shared with us, the wisdom you so freely gave us today. And for those who are on the call, if you haven't read this book already, we invite you to order it online. Check out Shannon's website, shannonpolson.com, and her YouTube channel. There's all kinds of information there that will be fuel for your learning. We hope you're all enjoying the routine that comes with being back in fall in Alberta. Kids back in school, courses starting up, university in full bloom. Learn, laugh, and love. Thank you all for joining us. And now we're going to sign off our Authors Speak series with Shannon Huffman Polson. Thank you.